Day 5, the 7th story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa Jevons. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 5, the 7th story. Teodoro, being enamoured of Violante, daughter of Messer Amerigo his lord, gets her with child, and is sentenced to the gallows. But while he is being scourged thither, he is recognized by his father, and being set at large, takes Violante to wife.
While they doubted whether the two lovers would be burned, the ladies were all fear and suspense. But when they heard of their deliverance, they all with one accord put on a cheerful countenance, praising God. The story ended, the queen ordained that the next should be told by Lauretta, who blithely thus began.
Fairest ladies, what time good King Guglielmo ruled Sicily, there dwelt on the island a gentleman, Messer Amerigo Abate da Trapani by name, who was well provided, as with other temporal goods, so also with children. For which cause, being in need of servants, he took occasion of the appearance in Trapani waters of certain Genoese corsairs from the Levant, who, scouring the coast of Armenia, had captured not a few boys, to purchase of them some of these youngsters, supposing them to be Turks, among whom, albeit most showed as mere shepherd boys, there was one, Teodoro by name, whose less rustic mien seemed to betoken gentle blood, who, though still treated as a slave, was suffered to grow up in the house with Messer Amerigo's children, and nature getting the better of circumstance, bore himself with such grace and dignity, that Messer Amerigo gladly gave him his freedom, and, still deeming him to be a Turk, had him baptized and named Pietro, and made him his major domo, and placed much trust in him. Now, among the other children that grew up in Messer Amerigo's house was his fair and dainty daughter Violante, and as her father was in no hurry to give her in marriage, it so befell that she became enamoured of Pietro. But for all her love, and the great conceit she had of his qualities and conduct, she nevertheless was too shamefast to discover her passion to him. However, love spared her the pains, for Pietro had cast many a furtive glance in her direction, and had grown so enamoured of her that 'twas never well with him except he saw her. But great was his fear lest any should detect his passion, for he deemed 'twould be the worse for him. The damsel, who was fain indeed of the sight of him, understood his case, and to encourage him dissembled not her exceeding great satisfaction. On which footing they remained a great while, neither venturing to say aught to the other, much as both longed to do so. But while they both burned with a mutual flame, Fortune, as if their entanglement were of her preordaining, found means to banish the fear and hesitation that kept them tongue-tied. Messer Amerigo possessed, a mile or so from Trapani, a goodly estate, to which he was wont not seldom to resort with his daughter and other ladies by way of recreation; and on one of these days, while there they tarried with Pietro, whom they had brought with them, suddenly, as will sometimes happen in summer, the sky became overcast with black clouds, insomuch that the lady and her companions, lest the storm should surprise them there, set out on their return to Trapani, making all the haste they might. But Pietro and the girl, being young, and sped perchance by love no less than by fear of the storm, completely outstripped her mother and the other ladies; and when they were gotten so far ahead as to be well nigh out of sight of the lady and all the rest, the thunder burst upon them peal on peal, hard upon which came a fall of hail very thick and close, from which the lady sought shelter in the house of a husbandman. Pietro and the damsel, finding no more convenient refuge, betook them to an old and all but ruinous, and now deserted, cottage, which, however, still had a bit of roof left, whereunder they both took their stand, in such close quarters, owing to the exiguity of the shelter, that they perforce touched one another. Which contact was the occasion that they gathered somewhat more courage to disclose their love, and so it was that Pietro began on this wise: "Now would to God that this hail might never cease, so that I might stay here for ever." "And well content were I," returned the damsel. And by their hands met, not without a tender pressure, and then they fell to embracing, and so to kissing one another while the hail continued, and, not to dwell on every detail, the sky was not clear before they had known the last degree of love's felicity, and had taken thought how they might secretly enjoy one another in the future. The cottage being close to the city gate, they hied them thither as soon as the storm was overpast, and having there awaited the lady, returned home with her. Nor, using all discretion, did they fail thereafter to meet from time to time in secret, to their no small solace, and the affair went so far that the damsel conceived, whereby they were both not a little disconcerted, insomuch that the damsel employed many artifices to arrest the course of nature, but to no effect. Wherefore Pietro, being in fear of his life, saw nothing for it but flight, and told her so. Whereupon, "If thou leave me," quoth she, "I shall certainly kill myself." Much as he loved her, Pietro answered, "Nay, but my lady, wherefore wouldst thou have me tarry here? Thy pregnancy will discover our offence. Thou wilt be readily forgiven, but 'twill be my woeful lot to bear the penalty of thy sin and mine." "Pietro," returned the damsel, "too well will they wot of my offence, but be sure that if thou confess not, none will ever wot of thine." Then quoth he, "Since thou givest me this promise, I will stay, but mind thou keep it." The damsel, who had done her best to keep her condition secret, saw at length by the increase of her bulk that 'twas impossible. Wherefore one day, most piteously bewailing herself, she made her avowal to her mother, and besought her to shield her from the consequences. Distressed beyond measure, the lady chid her severely, and then asked her how it had come to pass. The damsel, to screen Pietro, invented a story by which she put another complexion on the affair. The lady believed her, and that her fall might not be discovered, took her off to one of their estates, where the time of her delivery being come, and she, as women do in such a case, crying out for pain, it so befell that Messer Amerigo, whom the lady expected not, as indeed he was scarce ever wont to come there, did so, having been out a-hawking, and passing by the chamber where the damsel lay, marvelled to hear her cries, and forthwith entered, and asked what it meant. On sight of whom the lady rose, and sorrowfully gave him her daughter's version of what had befallen her. But he, less credulous than his wife, averred that it could not be true that she knew not by whom she was pregnant, and was minded to know the whole truth, let the damsel confess, and she might regain his favour, otherwise she must expect no mercy, and prepare for death. The lady did all she could to induce her husband to rest satisfied with what she had told him, but all to no purpose. Mad with rage, he rushed, drawn sword in hand, to his daughter's bedside, she, pending the parley, having given birth to a boy, and cried out, "Declare whose this infant is, or forthwith thou diest." Overcome by fear of death, the damsel broke her promise to Pietro, and made a clean breast of all that had passed between him and her. Whereat the knight, grown fell with rage, could scarcely refrain from slaying her. However, having given vent to his wrath in such words as it dictated, he remounted his horse and rode to Trapani, and there before one Messer Curado, the king's lieutenant, laid information of the wrong done him by Pietro, in consequence whereof Pietro, who suspected nothing, was forthwith taken, and being put to the torture, confessed all. Some days later the lieutenant sentenced him to be scourged through the city, and then hanged by the neck. And Messer Amerigo, being minded that one and the same hour should rid the earth of the two lovers and their son, for to have compassed Pietro's death was not enough to appease his wrath, mingled poison and wine in a goblet, and gave it to one of his servants with a drawn sword, saying, "Get thee with this gear to Violante, and tell her from me to make instant choice of one of these two deaths, either the poison or the steel. Else I will have her burned as she deserves, in view of all the citizens. Which done, thou wilt take the boy that she bore a few days ago, and beat his brains out against the wall, and cast his body for a prey to the dogs." Hearing the remorseless doom thus passed by the angry father upon both his daughter and his grandson, the servant, prompt to do evil rather than good, hide him thence. Now, as Pietro, in execution of his sentence, was being scourged to the gallows by the sergeants, 'twas so ordered by the leaders of the band, that he passed by an inn, where were 3 noblemen of Armenia, sent by the king of that country as ambassadors to Rome, to treat with the Pope of matters of the highest importance touching a crusade that was to be, who, having there alighted to rest and recreate them for some days, had received not a few tokens of honour from the nobles of Trapani, and most of all from Messer Amerigo. Hearing the tramp of Pietro's escort, they came to a window to see what was toward, and one of them, an aged man and of great authority, Fineo by name, looking hard at Pietro, who was stripped from the waist up and had his hands bound behind his back, espied on his breast a great spot of scarlet, not laid on by art, but wrought in the skin by operation of nature, being such as the ladies call a rose, which he no sooner saw than he was reminded of a son that had been stolen from him by corsairs on the coast of Lazistan some 15 years before, nor had he since been able to hear tidings of him. And guessing the age of the poor wretch that was being scourged, he set it down as about what his son's would be were he living, and what with the mark and the age, he began to suspect that 'twas even his son, and bethought him that if so, he would scarce as yet have forgotten his name or the speech of Armenia. Wherefore, as he was within earshot, he called to him, "Teodoro!" At the word, Pietro raised his head, whereupon Fineo, speaking in Armenian, asked him, "Whence and whose son art thou?" The sergeants that were leading him paused in deference to the great man, and so Pietro answered, "Of Armenia was I, son of one Fineo, brought hither by folk I wot not of, when I was but a little child." Then Fineo, witting that in very truth 'twas the boy that he had lost, came down with his companions weeping, and all the sergeants making way, he ran to him and embraced him, and doffing a mantle of richest texture that he wore, he prayed the captain of the band to be pleased to tarry there until he should receive orders to go forward, and was answered by the captain that he would willingly so wait. Fineo already knew, for 'twas bruited everywhere, the cause for which Pietro was being led to the gallows, wherefore he straightway hied him with his companions and their retinue to Messer Curado, and said to him, "Sir, this lad whom you are sending to the gallows like a slave is free born and my son, and is ready to take to wife her whom, as 'tis said, he has deflowered. So please you, therefore, delay the execution until such time as it may be understood whether she be minded to have him for a husband, lest, should she be so minded, you be found to have broken the law." Messer Curado marvelled to hear that Pietro was Fineo's son, and not without shame, albeit 'twas not his but fortune's fault, confessed that 'twas even as Fineo said, and having caused Pietro to be taken home with all speed, and Messer Amerigo to be brought before him, told him the whole matter. Messer Amerigo, who supposed that by this time his daughter and grandson must be dead, was the saddest man in the world to think that 'twas by his deed, witting that were the damsel still alive, all might very easily be set right. However, he sent post haste to his daughter's abode, revoking his orders if they were not yet carried out. The servant, whom he had earlier dispatched, had laid the sword and poison before the damsel, and, for that she was in no hurry to make her choice, was giving her foul words and endeavouring to constrain her thereto, when the messenger arrived. But on hearing the injunction laid upon him by his lord, he desisted and went back and told him how things stood. Whereupon Messer Amerigo, much relieved, hied him to Fineo, and well nigh weeping, and excusing himself for what had befallen as best he knew how, craved his pardon, and professed himself well content to give Teodoro, so he were minded to have her, his daughter to wife. Fineo readily accepted his excuses, and made answer, "'Tis my will that my son espouse your daughter, and, so he will not, let thy sentence passed upon him be carried out." So Fineo and Messer Amerigo being agreed, while Teodoro still languished in fear of death, albeit he was glad at heart to have found his father, they questioned him of his will in regard of this matter. When he heard that if he would he might have Violante to wife, Teodoro's delight was such that he seemed to leap from hell to paradise, and said that if 'twas agreeable to them all, he should deem it the greatest of favours. So they sent to the damsel to learn her pleasure, who, having heard how it had fared, and was now like to fare with Teodoro, albeit saddest of women, she looked for naught but death, began at length to give some credence to their words, and to recover heart a little, and answered that, were she to follow the bent of her desire, naught that could happen would delight her more than to be Teodoro's wife, but nevertheless she would do as her father bade her. So, all agreeing, the damsel was espoused with all pomp and festal cheer, to the boundless delight of all the citizens, and was comforted, and nurtured her little boy, and in no long time waxed more beautiful than ever before, and her confinement being ended, she presented herself before Fineo, who was then about to quit Rome on his homeward journey, and did him such reverence as is due to a father. Fineo, mightily well pleased to have so fair a daughter-in-law, caused to celebrate her nuptials most bravely and gaily, and received, and did ever thereafter entreat, her as his daughter. And so he took her, not many days after the festivities were ended, with his son and little grandson, aboard a galley, and brought them to Lazistan, and there thenceforth the two lovers dwelt with him in easeful and lifelong peace. End of Day 5, the 7th story.
Day 5, the 8th story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 5, the 8th story. Nastagio degli Onesti, loving a damsel of the Traversari family, by lavish expenditure gains not her love. At the instance of his kinsfolk, he hies him to Chiazi, where he sees a knight hunt a damsel and slay her, and cause her to be devoured by 2 dogs. He bids his kinsfolk and the lady that he loves to breakfast. During the meal, the said damsel is torn in pieces before the eyes of the lady, who, fearing a like fate, takes Nastagio to husband.
Lauretta was no sooner silent than thus at the queen's behest began Philomela.
Sweet ladies, as in us pity has ever its meed for praise, even so divine justice suffers not our cruelty to escape severe chastisement, the which that I may show you, and thereby dispose you utterly to banish that passion from your souls. I am minded to tell you a story no less touching than delightsome. In Ravenna, a most ancient city of Romagna, there dwelt of yore noblemen and gentlemen not a few, among whom was a young man, Nastagio degli Onesti by name, who by the death of his father and one of his uncles inherited immense wealth. Being without a wife, Nastagio, as 'tis the way with young men, became enamoured of a daughter of Messer Pablo Traversaro, a damsel of much higher birth than his, whose love he hoped to win by gifts and the like modes of courting, which, albeit they were excellent and fair and commendable, not only availed him not, but seemed rather to have the contrary effect, so harsh and ruthless and unrelenting did the beloved damsel show herself towards him, for whether it was her uncommon beauty or her noble lineage that puffed her up, so haughty and disdainful was she grown, that pleasure she had none either in him or in aught that pleased him, the burden of which disdain Nastagio found so hard to bear, that many a time, when he had made his moan, he longed to make away with himself. However, he refrained therefrom, and many a time resolved to give her up altogether, or, if so he might, to hold her in despite, as she did him. But 'twas in vain, for it seemed as if the more his hope dwindled, the greater grew his love, and as thus he continued, loving and spending inordinately, certain of his kinsfolk and friends, being apprehensive lest he should waste both himself and his substance, did many a time counsel and beseech him to depart to Ravenna, and go tarry for a time elsewhere, that so he might at once cool his flame and reduce his charges. For a long while Nastajio answered their admonitions with banter, but as they continued to ply him with them, he grew weary of saying no so often, and promised obedience. Whereupon he equipped himself as for a journey to France or Spain, or other distant parts, got on horseback, and sallied forth of Ravenna, accompanied by not a few of his friends, and being come to a place called Chiazi, about 3 miles from Ravenna, he halted, and having sent for tents and pavilions, told his companions that there he meant to stay, and they might go back to Ravenna. So Nastajio pitched his camp, and there commenced to live after as fine and lordly a fashion as did ever any man, bidding divers of his friends from time to time to breakfast or sup with him, as he had been wont to do. Now it so befell that about the beginning of May, the season being very fine, he fell a brooding on the cruelty of his mistress, and, that his meditations might be the less disturbed, he bade all his servants leave him, and sauntered slowly, wrapped in thought, as far as the pine wood, which he had threaded for a good half-mile, when, the 5th hour of the day being well nigh past, yet he, recking neither of food nor of aught else, 'twas as if he heard a woman wailing exceedingly, and uttering most piercing shrieks, whereat, the train of his sweet melancholy being broken, he raised his head to see what was toward, and wondered to find himself in the pine-wood, and saw, moreover, before him, running through a grove, close set with underwood and brambles, towards the place where he was, a damsel most comely, stark naked, her hair dishevelled, and her flesh all torn by the briars and brambles, who wept and cried piteously for mercy. And at her flanks he saw 2 mastiffs, exceedingly great and fierce, that ran hard upon her track, and not seldom came up with her and bit her cruelly, and in the rear he saw, riding a black horse, a knight sadly accoutred, and very wrathful of mien, carrying a rapier in his hand, and with despiteful blood-curdling words threatening her with death. Whereat he was at once amazed and appalled, and then filled with compassion for the hapless lady, whereof was bred a desire to deliver her, if so he might, from such anguish and peril of death. Wherefore, as he was unarmed, he ran and took in lieu of a cudgel a branch of a tree, with which he prepared to encounter the dogs and the knight, which the knight observing, called to him before he was come to close quarters, saying, "Hold off, Nastajio, leave the dogs and me alone to deal with this vile woman as she has deserved." And even as he spoke, the dogs gripped the damsel so hard on either flank that they arrested her flight, and the knight, being come up, dismounted, whom Nastajio approached, saying, "I know not who thou art, that knowest me so well, but thus much I tell thee, 'tis a gross outrage for an armed knight to go about to kill a naked woman, and set his dogs upon her as if she were a wild beast. Rest assured that I shall do all I can to protect her." Whereupon, "Nastajio," replied the knight, "of the same city as thou was I, and thou wast yet a little lad when I, Messer Guido degli Anastagi, by name, being far more enamoured of this damsel than thou art now of her, of the Traversan, was by her haughtiness and cruelty brought to so woeful a pass that one day in a fit of despair I slew myself with this rapier which thou seest in my hand, for which cause I am condemned to the eternal pains. Nor was it long after my death that she, who exulted therein over measure, also died, and for that she repented her not of her cruelty and the joy she had of my sufferings, for which she took not blame to herself, but merit, was likewise condemned to the pains of hell. Nor had she sooner made her descent, than for her pain and mine 'twas ordained that she should flee before me, and that I, who so loved her, should pursue her, not as my beloved lady, but as my mortal enemy. And so, as often as I come up with her, I slay her with this same rapier with which I slew myself, and having ripped her up by the back, I take out that hard and cold heart, to which neither love nor pity had ever access, and therewith her other inward parts, as thou shalt forthwith see, and cast them to these dogs to eat. And in no long time, as the just and mighty God decrees, she rises even as if she had not died, and recommences her dolorous flight, I and the dogs pursuing her. And it so falls out that every Friday about this hour I here come up with her, and slaughter her as thou shalt see. But ween not that we rest on other days, for there are other places in which I overtake her, places in which she used or devised how she might use me cruelly. On which wise, changed as thou seest from her lover into her foe, I am to pursue her for years as many as the months during which she showed herself harsh to me. Wherefore leave me to execute the decree of the divine justice, and presume not to oppose that which thou mayst not avail to withstand. Affrighted by the knight's words, insomuch that there was scarce a hair on his head but stood on end, Nastasia shrank back, still gazing on the hapless damsel, and waited all a tremble to see what the knight would do. Nor had he long to wait, for the knight, as soon as he had done speaking, sprang, rapier in hand, like a mad dog upon the damsel, who, kneeling, while the two mastiffs gripped her tightly, cried him mercy. But the knight, thrusting with all his force, struck her between the breasts, and ran her clean through the body. Thus striken, the damsel fell forthwith prone on the ground, sobbing and shrieking, whereupon the knight drew forth a knife, and having therewith opened her in the back, took out the heart and all the circumjacent parts, and threw them to the two mastiffs, who, being famished, forthwith devoured them. And in no time the damsel, as if naught thereof had happened, started to her feet, and took to flight towards the sea, pursued, as ever and anon bitten, by the dogs, while the knight, having gotten him to horse again, followed them as before, rapier in hand, and so fast sped they that they were quickly lost to Nastasia's sight. Long time he stood, musing on what he had seen, divided between pity and terror. And then it occurred to him that, as this passed every Friday, it might avail him not a little. So, having marked the place, he rejoined his servants, and in due time thereafter sent for some of his kinsfolk and friends, and said to them, "'Tis now a long while that you urge me to give up loving this lady that is no friend to me, and therewith make an end of my extravagant ways of living, and I am now ready to do so, provided you procure me one favour, to wit, that next Friday Messer Paolo Traversaro, and his wife and daughter, and all the ladies, their kinswomen, and as many other ladies as you may be pleased to bid, come hither to breakfast with me, when you will see for yourselves the reason why I so desire." A small matter this seemed to them, and so, on their return to Ravenna, they lost no time in conveying Nastasia's message to his intended guests, and, albeit she was hardly persuaded, yet in the end the damsel that Nastasia loved came with the rest. Nastasia caused a lordly breakfast to be prepared, and had the table set under the pines about the place where he had witnessed the slaughter of the cruel lady, and in ranging the ladies and gentlemen at table he so ordered it that the damsel whom he loved was placed opposite the spot where it should be enacted. The last course was just served, when the despairing cries of the hunted damsel became audible to all, to their no small amazement, and each asking, and none knowing, what it might import. Up they all started, intent to see what was toward, and perceived the suffering damsel, and the knight and the dogs, who in a trice were in their midst. They hurled amain to dogs and knight, and not a few advanced to succour the damsel. But the words of the knight, which were such as he had used to Nastasia, caused them to fall back, terror-stricken and lost in amazement. And when the knight proceeded to do as he had done before, all the ladies that were there, many of whom were of kin to the suffering damsel and to the knight, and called to mind his love and death, wept as bitterly as if 'twere their own case. When 'twas all over, and the lady and the knight had disappeared, the strange scene set those that witnessed it pondering many and diverse matters. But among them all none was so appalled as the cruel damsel that Nastasia loved, who, having clearly seen and heard all that had passed, and being aware that it touched her more nearly than any other by reason of the harshness that she had ever shown to Nastasia, seemed already to be fleeing from her angered lover, and to have the mastiffs on her flanks. And so great was her terror that, lest the like fate should befall her, she converted her aversion into affection, and as soon as occasion served, which was that very night, sent a trusty chambermaid privately to Nastasia with a request that he would be pleased to come to her, for that she was ready in all respects to pleasure him to the full. Nastasia made answer that he was greatly flattered, but that he was minded with her consent to have his pleasure of her in an honourable way, to wit, by marrying her. The damsel, who knew that none but herself was to blame that she was not already Nastasia's wife, made answer that she consented. Wherefore, by her own mouth, she acquainted her father and mother that she agreed to marry Nastasia, and they, heartily approving her choice, Nastasia wedded her on the ensuing Sunday, and lived happily with her many a years. Nor was it in her instance alone that this terror was productive of good. On the contrary, it so wrought among the ladies of Ravenna that they all became, and have ever since been, much more compliant with men's desires than they had been wont to be. End of Day 5. The 8th story.
Day 5, the 9th story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gesine. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J. M. Rigg. Day 5, the 9th story. Federigo degli Alberighi loves and is not loved in return. He wastes his substance by lavishness until naught is left but a single falcon, which, his lady being come to see him at his house, he gives for her to eat. She, knowing his case, changes her mind, takes him to husband, and makes him rich.
So ended Philomela, and the queen, being aware that besides herself only Dioneo, by virtue of his privilege, was left to speak, said with gladsome mien,
"'Tis now for me to take up my parable, which, dearest ladies, I will do with a story like in some degrees to the foregoing, and that not only that you may know how potent are your charms to sway the gentle heart, but that you may also learn how upon fitting occasions to make bestowal of your guerdons of your own accord, instead of always waiting for the guidance of fortune, which most times, not wisely, but without rule or measure, scatters her gifts. You are then to know that Corpo di Borghese Dominici, a man that in our day was, and perchance still is, had in respect and great reverence in our city, being not only by reason of his noble lineage, but, and yet more, for manners and merit most illustrious, and worthy of eternal renown, was in his old age not seldom wont to amuse himself by discoursing of things past with his neighbours and other folk, wherein he had not his match for accuracy, and compass of memory and concinnity of speech. Among other good stories, he would tell how that there was of yore in Florence a gallant named Federigo di Messer Filippo Alberighi, who for feats of arms and courtesy had not his peer in Tuscany, who, as is the common lot of gentlemen, became enamoured of a lady named Monna Giovanna, who in her day held rank among the fairest and most elegant ladies of Florence, to gain whose love he jousted, tilted, gave entertainments, scattered largesse, and, in short, set no bounds to his expenditure. However, the lady, no less virtuous than fair, cared not a jot for what he did for her sake, nor yet for him. Spending thus greatly beyond his means, and making nothing, Federigo could hardly fail to come to lack, and was at length reduced to such poverty that he had nothing left but a little estate, on the rents of which he lived very straitly, and a single falcon, the best in the world. The estate was at Campi, and thither, deeming it no longer possible for him to live in the city as he desired, he repaired, more in love than ever before, and there, in complete seclusion, diverting himself with hawking, he bore his poverty as patiently as he might. Now Federigo being thus reduced to extreme poverty, it so happened that one day Monna Giovanna's husband, who was very rich, fell ill, and seeing that he was nearing his end, made his will, whereby he left his estate to his son, who was now growing up, and in the event of his death without lawful heir, named Monna Giovanna, whom he dearly loved, heir in his stead, and having made these dispositions he died. Monna Giovanna, being thus left a widow, did as our ladies are wont, and repaired in the summer to one of her estates in the country, which lay very near to that of Federigo. And so it befell that the urchin began to make friends with Federigo, and to show a fondness for hawks and dogs, and having seen Federigo's falcon fly not a few times, took a singular fancy to him, and greatly longed to have him for his own, but still did not dare to ask him of Federigo, knowing that Federigo prized him so much. So the matter stood when by chance the boy fell sick, whereby the mother was sore distressed, for he was her only son, and she loved him as much as might be, insomuch that all day long she was beside him, and ceased not to comfort him, and again asked him if there were aught that he wished for, imploring him to say the word, and, if it might by any means be had, she would assuredly do her utmost to procure it for him. Thus repeatedly exhorted, the boy said, "Mother mine, do but get me Federigo's falcon, and I doubt not I shall soon be well." Whereupon the lady was silent a while, bethinking her what she should do. She knew that Federigo had long loved her, and had never so much as a single kind look from her. Wherefore she said to herself, "How can I send or go to beg of him this falcon, which by what I hear is the best that ever flew, and moreover is his sole comfort? And how could I be so unfeeling as to seek to deprive a gentleman of the sole solace that is now left him?" And so, albeit she very well knew that she might have the falcon for the asking, she was perplexed, and knew not what to say, and gave her son no answer. At length, however, the love she bore the boy carried the day, and she made up her mind, for his contentment, come what might, not to send, but to go herself and fetch him the falcon. So, "Be of good cheer, my son," she said, "and doubt not thou wilt soon be well, for I promise thee that the very first thing that I shall do tomorrow morning will be to go and fetch thee the falcon." Whereat the child was so pleased that he began to mend that very day. On the morrow the lady, as if for pleasure, hied her with another lady to Federigo's little house, and asked to see him. 'Twas still, as for some days past, no weather for hawking, and Federigo was in his garden, busy about some small matters which needed to be set right there. When he heard that Monna Giovanna was at the door, asking to see him, he was not a little surprised and pleased, and hied him to her with all speed. As soon as she saw him, she came forward to meet him with a womanly grace, and having received his respectful salutation, said to him, "Good morning, Federigo," and continued, "I am come to requite thee for what thou hast lost by loving me more than thou shouldst, which compensation is this, that I and this lady that accompanies me will breakfast with thee without ceremony this morning." "Madam," Federigo replied with all humility, "I mind not ever to have lost aught by loving you, but rather to have been so much profited that, if I ever deserved well in aught, 'twas to your merit that I owed it, and to the love that I bore you. And of a surety, had I still as much to spend as I have spent in the past, I should not prize it so much as this visit you so frankly pay me, come as you are to one who can afford you but a sorry sort of hospitality. Which said, with some confusion, he bade her welcome to his house, and then led her into his garden, where, having none else to present to her, by way of companion, he said, Madam, as there is none other here, this good woman, wife of this husbandman, will bear you company, while I go to have the table set. Now, albeit his poverty was extreme, yet he had not known as yet how sore was the need to which his extravagance had reduced him. But this morning 'twas brought home to him, for that he could find nought wherewith to do honour to the lady, for love of whom he had done the honours of his house to men without number. Wherefore, distressed beyond measure, and inwardly cursing his evil fortune, he sped hither and thither like one beside himself, but never a coin found he, nor yet aught to pledge. Meanwhile it grew late, and sorely he longed that the lady might not leave his house altogether unhonoured, and yet to crave help of his husbandman was more than his pride could brook. In these desperate straits his glance happened to fall on his brave falcon, on his perch in his little parlour. And so, as a last resource, he took him, and finding him plump, deemed that he would make a dish meet for such a lady. Wherefore, without thinking twice about it, he wrung the bird's neck, and caused his maid forthwith pluck him and set him on a spit, and roast him carefully. And having still some spotless table linen, he had the table laid therewith, and with a cheerful countenance hied him back to his lady in the garden, and told her that such breakfast as he could give her was ready. So the lady and her companion rose and came to table, and there, with Federigo, who was waiting on them most faithfully, ate the brave falcon, knowing not what they ate. When they were risen from table, and had dallied a while in gay converse with him, the lady deemed it time to tell the reason of her visit, wherefore, graciously addressing Federigo, thus began she: Federigo, by what thou rememberest of thy past life and my virtue, which, perchance, thou hast deemed harshness and cruelty, I doubt not thou must marvel at my presumption when thou hearest the main purpose of my visit. But if thou hadst sons, or hadst had them, so that thou mightest know the full force of the love that is borne them, I should make no doubt that thou wouldst hold me in part excused. Now having a son, may I, for that thou hast none, claim exemption from the laws to which all other mothers are subject, and being thus bound to own their sway, I must, though fain were I not, and though 'tis neither meet nor right, crave of thee that which I know thou dost of all things and with justice prize most highly, seeing that this extremity of thy adverse fortune has left thee naught else wherewith to delight, divert, and console thee, which gift is no other than thy falcon, on which my boy has set his heart, that if I bring him it not, I fear lest he grow so much worse of the malady that he has, that thereby it may come to pass that I lose him. And so, not for the love which thou dost bear me, and which may nowise bind thee, but for that nobleness of temper whereof in courtesy more conspicuously than that aught else thou hast given me proof, I implore thee that thou be pleased to give me the bird, that thereby I may say that I have kept my son alive, and thus made him for aye thy debtor. No sooner had Federigo apprehended what the lady wanted, than for grief that 'twas not in his power to serve her, because he had given her the falcon to eat, he fell a weeping in her presence, before he could so much as utter a word. At first the lady supposed that 'twas only because he was loath to part with the brave falcon that he wept, and as good as made up her mind that he would refuse her. However, she awaited with patience Federigo's answer, which was on this wise. Madam, since it pleased God that I should set my affections upon you, there have been matters not a few, in which to my sorrow I have deemed fortune adverse to me. But they have all been trifles in comparison of the trick that she now plays me, the which I shall never forgive her, seeing that you are come here to my poor house, where, while I was rich, you deigned not to come, and ask a trifling favour of me, which she has put it out of my power to grant. How 'tis so, I will briefly tell you. When I learned that you, of your grace, were minded to breakfast with me, having respect for your high dignity and desert, I deemed it due and seemly that in your honour I should regale you, to the best of my power, with fare of more excellent quality than is commonly set before others; and, calling to mind the falcon which you now ask of me, and his excellence, I judged him meet food for you. And so you have had him roasted on the trencher this morning, and well indeed I thought I had bestowed him; but as I now see that you would fain have had him in another guise, so mortified am I that I am not able to serve you, that I doubt I shall ever know peace of mind more. In witness whereof he had the feathers and feet and beak of the bird brought in and laid before her. The first thing the lady did, when she had heard Federigo's story, and seen the relics of the bird, was to chide him that he had killed so fine a falcon to furnish a woman with a breakfast. After which the magnanimity of her host, which poverty had been, and was, powerless to impair, elicited no small share of inward commendation. Then, frustrate of her hopes of possessing the falcon, and doubting of her son's recovery, she took her leave with the heaviest of hearts, and hied her back to the boy, who, whether for fretting that he might not have the falcon, or by the unaided energy of his disorder, departed this life not many days after, to the exceeding great grief of his mother. For a while she would do naught but weep and bitterly bewail herself, but being still young and left very wealthy, she was often urged by her brothers to marry again, and though she would rather have not done so, yet being importuned, and remembering Federigo's high desert, and the magnificent generosity with which he had finally killed his falcon to do her honour, she said to her brothers, "Gladly, with your consent, would I remain a widow, but if you will not be satisfied except I take a husband, rest assured that none other will I ever take save Federigo degli Alberighi." Whereupon her brothers derided her, saying, "Foolish woman, what is't thou sayst? How should thou want Federigo, who has not a thing in the world?" To whom she answered, "My brothers, well wot I that 'tis as you say, but I had rather have a man without wealth than wealth without a man." The brothers, perceiving that her mind was made up, and knowing Federigo for a good man and true, poor though he was, gave her to him with all her wealth. And so Federigo, being mated with such a wife, and one that he had so much loved, and being very wealthy to boot, lived happily, keeping more exact accounts, to the end of his days. End of Day 5, the 9th story.
Day 5, the 10th story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Decameron, by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J. M. Rigg. Day 5, the 10th story. Pietro da Vinciolo goes from home to sup. His wife brings a boy into the house to bear her company. Pietro returns, and she hides her gallant under a hen-coop. Pietro explains that in the house of Ercolano, with whom he was to have supped, there was discovered a young man, bestowed there by Ercolano's wife. The lady thereupon censures Ercolano's wife, but unluckily an ass treads on the fingers of the boy that is hidden under the hen-coop, so that he cries for pain. Pietro runs to the place, sees him, and apprehends the trick played on him by his wife, which, nevertheless, he finally condones, for that he is not himself free from blame.
When the queen had done speaking, and all had praised God that he had worthily rewarded Federigo, Dioneo, who never waited to be bidden, thus began.
I know not whether I am to term it a vice accidental and superinduced by bad habits in us mortals, or whether it be a fault seated in nature, that we are more prone to laugh at things dishonourable than at good deeds, and that more especially when they concern not ourselves. However, as the sole scope of all my efforts has been, and still shall be, to dispel your melancholy, and in lieu thereof to minister to you laughter and jollity, therefore, enamoured, my damsels, albeit the ensuing story is not altogether free from matter that is scarce seemly, yet, as it may afford you pleasure, I shall not fail to relate it, premonishing you, my hearers, that you take it with the like discretion, as when, going into your gardens, you stretch forth your delicate hands and cull the roses, leaving the thorns alone, which, being interpreted, means that you will leave the caitiff husband to abide in sorry plight with his dishonour, and will gaily laugh at the amorous wiles of his wife, and commiserate her unfortunate gallant, when occasion requires. 'Tis no great while since there dwelt at Perugia a rich man named Pietro de Vinciolo, who rather, perchance, to blind others and mitigate the evil repute in which he was held by the citizens of Perugia, than for any desire to wed, took a wife; and such being his motive, fortune provided him with just such a spouse as he merited. For the wife of his choice was a stout red-haired young woman, and so hot-blooded that 2 husbands would have been more to her mind than one, whereas one fell to her lot that gave her only a subordinate place in his regard, which she perceiving, while she knew herself to be fair and lusty, and felt herself to be gamesome and fit, waxed very wroth, and now and again had high words with her husband, and led but a sorry life with him at most times. Then, seeing that thereby she was more like to fret herself than to dispose her husband to conduct less base, she said to herself, This poor creature deserts me to go walk in pattens in the dry, wherefore it shall go hard but I will bring another aboard the ship for the wet weather. I married him, and brought him a great and goodly dowry, knowing that he was a man, and supposing him to have the desires which men have, and ought to have. And had I not deemed him to be a man, I should never have married him. He knew me to be a woman. Why then took he me to wife, if women were not to his mind? 'Tis not to be endured. Had I not been minded to live in the world, I had become a nun; and being minded there to live, as I am, if I am to wait until I have pleasure or solace of him, I shall wait perchance until I am old, and then too late I shall bethink me to my sorrow that I have wasted my youth. And as to the way in which I should seek its proper solace, I need no better teacher and guide than him, who finds his delight where I should find mine, and finds it to his own condemnation, whereas in me 'twere commendable. 'Tis but the laws that I shall set at naught, whereas he sets both them and nature herself at naught. So the good lady reasoned, and peradventure more than once, and then, casting about how she might privily compass her end, she made friends with an old beldam, that showed as a veritable Santa Verdiana, foster mother of vipers, who was ever to be seen going to pardonings with a parcel of paternosters in her hand, and talked of nothing but the lives of the holy fathers and the wounds of St. Francis, and was generally reputed a saint, to whom in due time she opened her whole mind. My daughter, replied the beldam, God, who knows all things, knows that thou wilt do very rightly indeed. Were it for no other reason, 'twould be meet for thee and every other young woman so to do, that the heyday of youth be not wasted, for there is no grief like that of knowing that it has been wasted. And what the devil are we women fit for when we are old, except to pore over the cinders on the hearth? The which, if any know and may attest, 'tis I, who, now that I am old, call to mind the time that I let slip from me, not without most sore and bitter and fruitless regret. and albeit 'twas not all wasted, for I would not have thee think that I was entirely without sense, yet I did not make the best use of it, whereof when I bethink me, and that I am now, even as thou seest me, such a hag that never a spark of fire may I hope to get from any, God knows how I rue it. Now with men 'tis otherwise. They are born meet for 1,000 uses, not for this alone, and the more part of them are of much greater consequence in old age than in youth. But women are fit for naught but this, and 'tis but for that they bear children that they are cherished. Whereof, if not otherwise, thou mayst assure thyself, if thou do but consider that we are ever ready for it, which is not the case with men. Besides which, one woman will tire out many men without being herself tired out. Seeing then that 'tis for this we are born, I tell thee again that thou wilt do very rightly to give thy husband thy loaf for his cake, that in thy old age thy soul may have no cause of complaint against thy flesh. Every one has just as much of this life as he appropriates, and this is especially true of women, whom therefore it behoves much more than men to seize the moment as it flies. Indeed, as thou mayest see for thyself, when we grow old, neither husband nor any other man will spare us a glance, but on the contrary they banish us to the kitchen, there to tell stories to the cat, and to count the pots and pans, or worse, they make rhymes about us, to the damsel Daintybits, to the beldam Ague fits, and such like catches. But to make no more words about it, I tell thee at once that there is no person in the world to whom thou couldst open thy mind with more advantage than to me. For there is no gentleman so fine but I dare speak my mind to him, nor any so harsh and forbidding but I know well how to soften him and fashion him to my will. Tell me only what thou wouldst have, and leave the rest to me. But one word more, I pray thee to have me in kindly remembrance, for that I am poor, and thou shalt henceforth go shares with me in all my indulgences and every paternoster that I say, that God may make thereof light and tapers for thy dead. Wherewith she ended. So the lady came to an understanding with the beldam, that as soon as she set eyes on a boy that often came along that street, and of whom the lady gave her a particular description, she would know what she was to do. And thereupon the lady gave her a chunk of salt meat, and bade her God speed. The beldam before long smuggled into the lady's chamber the boy of whom she had spoken, and not long after another, such being the humour of the lady, who, standing in perpetual dread of her husband, was disposed in this particular to make the most of her opportunities. And one of these days, her husband being to sup in the evening with a friend called Ercolano, the lady bade the beldam bring her a boy as pretty and dainty as was to be found in Perugia, and so the beldam forthwith did. But the lady and the boy being set at table to sup, lo! Pietro's voice was heard at the door bidding open to him. Whereupon the lady gave herself up for dead, but being fain, if she might, to screen the boy, and knowing not where else to convey or conceal him, bestowed him under a hen coop that stood in a verandah hard by the chamber in which they were supping, and threw over it a sorry mattress that she had that day emptied of its straw; which done, she hastened to open the door to her husband, saying to him as he entered, "You have gulped your supper mighty quickly to night." Whereto Pietro replied, "We have not so much as tasted it." "How so?" inquired the lady. "I will tell thee," said Pietro. "No sooner were we set at table, Ercolano, his wife, and I, than we heard a sneeze close to us, to which, though 'twas repeated, we paid no heed. But as the sneezer continued to sneeze a third, a fourth, a fifth, and many another time to boot, we all began to wonder; and Ercolano, who was somewhat out of humour with his wife, because she had kept us a long time at the door before she opened it, burst out in a sort of rage with 'What means this? Who is't that thus sneezes?' and made off to a stair hard by, beneath which, and close to its foot, was a wooden closet, of the sort which, when folk are furnishing their houses, they commonly cause to be placed there, to stow things in upon occasion. And as it seemed to him that the sneezing proceeded thence, he undid the wicket, and no sooner had he opened it than out flew never so strong a stench of brimstone, albeit we had already been saluted by a whiff of it, and complained thereof, but had been put off by the lady with 'Tis but a while ago I bleached my veils with brimstone, having sprinkled it on a dish that they might catch its fumes, which dish I then placed under the stair, so that it still smells a little. However, the door being now, as I have said, open, and the smoke somewhat less dense, Ercolano, peering in, espied the fellow that had sneezed, and who still kept sneezing, being thereto constrained by the pungency of the brimstone. And for all he sneezed, yet was he by this time so well nigh choked with the brimstone that he was like neither to sneeze nor to do aught else again. As soon as he caught sight of him, Ercolano bawled out, "Now I see, madam, why 'twas that a while ago, when we came here, we were kept waiting so long at the gate before 'twas opened. But woe betide me for the rest of my days if I pay you not out." Whereupon the lady, perceiving that her offence was discovered, ventured no excuse, but fled from the table, whither I know not. Ercolano, ignoring his wife's flight, bade the sneezer again and again to come forth, but he, being by this time fairly spent, budged not an inch for aught that Ercolano said. Wherefore Ercolano caught him by one of his feet and dragged him forth, and ran off for a knife with intent to kill him. But I, standing in fear of the Signory on my own account, got up and would not suffer him to kill the fellow, or to do him any hurt, and for his better protection raised the alarm, whereby some of the neighbours came up and took the lad, more dead than alive, and bore him off, I know not whither. However, our supper being thus rudely interrupted, not only have not gulped it, but I have not so much as tasted it, as I said before. Her husband's story showed his wife that there were other ladies as knowing as she, albeit misfortune might sometimes overtake them, and gladly would she have spoken out in defence of Ercolano's wife, but thinking that by censuring another's sin she would secure more scope for her own, she launched out on this wise: "Fine doings indeed! A right virtuous and saintly lady she must be. Here is the loyalty of an honest woman, and one to whom I lief have confessed, so spiritual I deemed her. And the worst of it is, that being no longer young, she sets a rare example to those that are so. Curses on the hour that she came into the world! Curses upon her, that she makes not away with herself! Basest, most faithless of women she must needs be. The reproach of her sex, the opprobrium of all the ladies in this city, to cast aside all regard for her honour, her marriage vow, her reputation before the world, and lost to all sense of shame, to scruple not to bring disgrace upon a man so worthy, a citizen so honourable, a husband by whom she was so well treated, ay, and upon herself to boot. By my hope of salvation, no mercy should be shown to such women. They should pay the penalty with their lives. To the fire with them while they yet live, and let them be burned to ashes." Then, calling to mind the lover that she had close at hand in the hen coop, she fell to coaxing Pietro to get him to bed, for the hour grew late. Pietro, who was more set on eating than sleeping, only asked whether there was aught he might have by way of supper. "Supper, forsooth!" replied the lady. "Ay, of course, 'tis our way to make much of supper when thou art not at home. As if I were Ercolano's wife! Now, wherefore tarry longer? Go, get thy night's rest. 'Twere far better for thee." Now, so it was that some of Pietro's husbandmen had come to the house that evening with divers things from the farm, and had put up their asses in a stable that adjoined the verandah, but had neglected to water them. And one of the asses, being exceeding thirsty, got his head out of the halter and broke loose from the stable, and went about nosing everything, if haply he might come by water, whereby he came upon the hen coop, beneath which was the boy, who, being constrained to stand on all fours, had the fingers of one hand somewhat protruding from under the hen coop, and so, as luck, or rather ill luck, would have it, the ass trod on them, whereat, being sorely hurt, he set up a great howling, much to the surprise of Pietro, who perceived that 'twas within his house. So forth he came, and hearing the boy still moaning and groaning, for the ass still kept his hoof hard down on the fingers, called out, "Who is there?" and ran to the hen coop and raised it, and espied the fellow, who, besides the pain that the crushing of his fingers by the ass's hoof occasioned him, trembled in every limb for fear that Pietro should do him a mischief. He was one that Pietro had long been after for his foul purposes. So Pietro, recognizing him, asked him, "What dost thou here?" The boy, making no answer, save to beseech him for the love of God to do him no hurt, Pietro continued, "Get up, have no fear that I shall hurt thee, but tell me, how and for what cause camest thou to be here?" The boy then confessed everything, whereupon Pietro, as elated by the discovery as his wife was distressed, took him by the hand, and led him into the room where the lady, in the extremity of terror, awaited him, and, having seated himself directly in front of her, said, "'Twas but a moment ago that thou didst curse Ercolano's wife, and averred that she ought to be burned, and that she was the reproach of your sex. Why saidst thou not of thyself? Or if thou wast not minded to accuse thyself, how hadst thou the effrontery to censure her, knowing that thou hadst done even as she? Verily, 'twas for no other reason than that ye are all fashioned thus, and study to cover your own misdeeds with the delinquency of others. Would that fire might fall from heaven and burn you all, brood of iniquity that ye are!" The lady, marking that in the first flush of his wrath he had given her nothing worse than hard words, and discerning as she thought that he was secretly overjoyed to hold so beautiful a boy by the hand, took heart of grace, and said, "I doubt not indeed that thou wouldst be well pleased that fire should fall from heaven and devour us all, seeing that thou art as fond of us as a dog is of the stick, though by the holy rood thou wilt be disappointed. But I would fain have a little argument with thee, to know whereof thou complainest. Well indeed were it for me, didst thou but place me on an equality with Ercolano's wife, who is an old sanctimonious hypocrite, and has of him all that she wants, and is cherished by him as a wife should be. But that is not my case, for granted that thou givest me garments and shoes to my mind, thou knowest how otherwise ill bested I am, and how long it is since last thou didst lie with me, and far liefer had I go barefoot and in rags, and have thy benevolence abed, than have all that I have, and be treated as thou dost treat me. Understand me, Pietro, be reasonable, consider that I am a woman like other women, with a like craving, whereof if thou deny me the gratification, 'tis no blame to me that I seek it elsewhere, and at least I do thee so much honour as not to foregather with stable boys or scurvy knaves." Pietro perceived that she was like to continue in this vein the whole night, wherefore, indifferent as he was to her, he said, "Now, madam, no more of this. In the matter of which thou speakest I will content thee, but of thy great courtesy let us have something to eat by way of supper, for methinks the boy, as well as I, has not yet supped." "Ay, true enough," said the lady, "he has not supped, for we were but just sitting down to table to sup, when, beshrew thee, thou madest thy appearance." "Go then," said Pietro, "get us some supper, and by I will arrange this fare in such a way that thou shalt have no more cause of complaint." The lady, perceiving that her husband was now tranquil, rose, and soon had the table laid again, and spread with the supper which she had ready, and so they made a jolly meal of it, the caitiff husband, the lady, and the boy. What, after supper, Pietro devised for their mutual satisfaction has slipped from my memory, but as much as this I know, that on the morrow, as he wended his way to the piazza, the boy would have been puzzled to say whether of the twain, the wife or the husband, had had the most of his company during the night. But this I would say to you, dear my ladies, that whoso gives you tit, why, just give him tat, and if you cannot do it at once, why, bear it in mind until you can, that even as the ass gives, so he may receive. End of Day 5, the 10th story.
Day 5. The conclusion of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by M. Rigg. Day 5. The conclusion. Dioneo's story, whereat the ladies laughed, the less for shamefastness rather than for disrelish, being ended, the queen, taking note that the term of her sovereignty was come, rose to her feet, and took off the laurel wreath, and set it graciously upon Elisa's head, saying, "Madam, 'tis now your turn to bear sway." The dignity accepted, Elisa followed in all respects the example of her predecessors. She first conferred with the seneschal, and directed him how meetly to order all things during the time of her sovereignty, which done to the satisfaction of the company. "Oft times," quoth she, "have we heard how with bright sallies, and ready retorts, and sudden devices, not a few have known how to repugn, with apt checks, the bites of others, or to avert imminent perils; and because 'tis an excellent argument, and may be profitable, I ordain that to morrow, God helping us, the following be the rule of our discourse, to wit, that it be of such as by some sprightly sally have repulsed an attack, or by some ready retort or device have avoided loss, peril, or scorn." The rule being heartily approved by all, the queen rose and dismissed them till supper time. So the honorable company, seeing the queen risen, rose all likewise, and as their wont was, betook them to their diversions as to each seemed best. But when the cigales had hushed their chirping, all were mustered again for supper, and having blithely feasted, they all addressed them to song and dance. And the queen, while Emilia led a dance, called for a song from Dioneo, who at once came out with "Monna Audruda, come perk up thy mood, a piece of glad tidings I bring thee." Whereat all the ladies fell a laughing, and most of all the queen, who bade him give them no more of that, but sing another. Quoth Dioneo, "Madam, had I a tabret, I would sing 'Up with your smoke, Monna Lapa,' or 'Oh, the greensward under the olive.' Or perchance you had liefer I should give you 'Woe is me, the wave of the sea.' But no tabret have I, wherefore choose which of these others you will have. Perchance you would like, 'Now hie thee to us forth, that so it may be cut, as may the fields about.'" "No," returned the queen, "give us another." "Then," said Dioneo, "I will sing 'Monna Simona, embarrel,' why, 'tis not the month of October." "Now a plague upon thee," said the queen, with a laugh, "give us a proper song will do, for we will have none of these." "Never fear, madam," replied Dioneo, "only say which you prefer. I have more than 1,000 songs by heart. Perhaps you would like 'This my little covert, make I never it avert,' or 'Gently, gently, husband mine,' or '£100 were none too high a price for me a cock to buy.'" The queen now shewed some offence, though the other ladies laughed, and, "A truce to thy jesting, Dioneo," said she, "and give us a proper song, else thou mayst prove the quality of my ire." Whereupon Dioneo forthwith ceased his fooling, and sang on this wise:
So ravishing a light doth from the fair eyes of my mistress move, as keeps me slave to her and thee, O love. A beam from those bright orbs did radiate that flame that through mine own eyes to my breast did whilom entrance gain. Thy majesty, O love, thy might, how great they be! 'Twas her fair face did manifest, whereon to brood still fain I felt thee take, and chain each sense, my soul enthralling on such wise that she alone henceforth evokes my sighs. Wherefore, O dear my love, myself I own thy slave, and all obedience wait and yearn till thy might me console. Yet wot I not, if it be truly known, how noble is the flame wherewith I burn. My loyalty how whole to her that doth control, even in such sort, my mind, that shall I none, nor would I, peace receive, save hers alone. And so I pray thee, sweet my lord, that thou give her to feel thy fire, and show her plain how grievous my disease. This service deign to render, for that now thou seest me waste for love, and in the pain dissolve me by degrees, and then the apt moment seize my cause to plead with her, as is but due from thee to me, who fain with thee would sue.
When Dioneo's silence shewed that his song was ended, the Queen accorded it no stinted meed of praise, after which she caused not a few other songs to be sung. Thus passed some part of the night, and then the Queen, taking note that its freshness had vanquished the heat of the day, bade all go to rest them, if they would, till the morning. End of conclusion of Day 5.
Day 6. The Introduction of the Decameron. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by H. M. Rigg. Day the 6th. The Introduction. Endeth here the 5th day of the Decameron. Beginneth the 6th, wherein, under the rule of Elisa, discourse is had of such as by some sprightly sally have repulsed an attack, or by some ready retort or device have avoided loss, peril, or scorn. Still in mid-heaven the moon had lost her radiance, nor was any part of our world unillumined by the fresh splendor of the dawn, when the Queen being risen and having mustered her company, they heed them, gently sauntering across the dewy mead some distance from the beautiful hill, conversing now of this, now of the other matter, canvassing the stories, their greater or less degree of beauty, and laughing afresh at divers of their incidents, until, the sun being now in his higher ascendant, they began to feel his heat, and turning back by common consent, retraced their steps to the palace, where the tables being already set, and fragrant herbs and fair flowers strewn all about, they, by the Queen's command, before it should grow hotter, addressed themselves to their meal. So having blithely breakfasted, they first of all sang some dainty and jocund ditties, and then, as they were severally minded, composed them to sleep or set them down to chess or dice, while Dioneo and Lauretta fell a-singing of Troilus and Cressida. The hour of session being come, they took their places, at the Queen's summons, in their wonted order by the fountain. But when the Queen was about to call for the first story, that happened which had not happened before, to wit, there being a greater uproar in the kitchen among the maids and men, the sound thereof reached the ears of the Queen and all the company. Whereupon the Queen called the seneschal and asked him who bawled so loud, and what was the occasion of the uproar. The seneschal made answer that it was some contention between Lyciska and Tindaro, but the occasion he knew not, having but just come to quiet them, when he received her summons. The Queen then bade him cause Lyciska and Tindaro to come thither forthwith. So they came, and the Queen inquired of them the cause of the uproar. Tindaro was about to make answer, when Lyciska, who was somewhat advanced in years and disposed to give herself airs, and heated to the strife of words, turned to Tindaro and scowling upon him said, "Unmannerly varlet, that makest bold to speak before me, leave me to tell the story." Then turning to the Queen she said, "Madam, this fellow would fain instruct me as to Sycophante's wife, and neither more or less, as if I had not known her well, would have me believe that, the first night that Sycophante lay with her, it was by force and not without effusion of blood that Master Yard made his way into Dusky Hill, which I deny, averring that he met with no resistance, but on the contrary, with a hearty welcome on the part of the garrison. And such a numbskull is he as fondly to believe that the girls are so simple as to let slip their opportunities, while they wait on the caprice of father or brothers, who 6 times out of 7 delay to marry them for 3 or 4 years after they should. Ay, ay, indeed, Doubtless they were well advised to tarry so long. Christ's face! I should know the truth of what I swear. There is never a woman in my neighborhood whose husband had her virginity, and well I know how many and what manner of tricks our married dames play their husbands, and Eustace Booby would fain teach me to know woman as if I were but born yesterday. While Lyciska thus spoke, the ladies laughed, till all their teeth were ready to start from their heads. 6 times at least the queen bade her be silent, but all in vain. She halted not till she had said all that she had a mind to. When she had done, the queen turned with a smile to Dioneo, saying, This is a question for thee to deal with, Dioneo. So hold thyself in readiness to give final judgment upon it when our stories are ended. Madame, replied Dioneo forthwith, I give judgment without more ado. I say that Lyciska is in the right. I believe that it is even as she says, and that Tindaro is a fool. Whereupon Lyciska burst out laughing, and turning to Tindaro, Now did I not tell thee so? quoth she. Begone, in God's name. Dost think to know more than I, thou that art but a sucking babe? Thank God, I have not lived for nothing, not I. And had not the queen sternly bade her be silent, and make no more disturbance, unless she had a mind to be whipped, and send both her and Tindaro back to the kitchen, the whole day would have been spent in naught but listening to her. So Lyciska and Tindaro having withdrawn, the queen charged Philomela to tell the first story, and gaily thus Philomela began. End of Day 6, the Introduction.
Day 6, the first story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 6, the first story. A knight offers to carry Madonna Oretta a horseback with a story, but tells it so ill that she prays him to dismount her. As stars are set for an ornament in the serene expanse of heaven, and likewise in springtime flowers and leafy shrubs in the green meadows, so damsels in the hour of rare and excellent discourse is wit with its bright sallies, which, being brief, are much more proper for ladies than for men, seeing that proxility of speech, where brevity is possible, is much less allowable to them. But for whatever cause, be it the sorry quality of our understanding, or some especial enmity that heaven bears to our generation, few ladies or none are left to-day that when occasion prompts are able to meet it with apt speech, or if aught of the kind they hear, can understand it aright. To our common shame be it spoken. But as, touching this matter, enough has already been said by Pampinea, I purpose not to enlarge thereon, but, that you may know that excellence resides in speech apt for the occasion, I am minded to tell you after how courteous a fashion a lady imposed silence upon a gentleman. 'Tis no long time since there dwelt in our city a lady, noble, debonair, and of excellent discourse, whom not a few of you may have seen or heard of, whose name, for such high qualities merit not oblivion, was Madonna Oretta, her husband being Messer Geri Spina. Now this lady, happening to be, as we are, in the country, moving from place to place for pleasure with a company of ladies and gentlemen, whom she had entertained the day before at breakfast at her house, and the place of their next sojourn, whither they were to go afoot, being some considerable distance off, one of the gentlemen of the company said to her, Madonna Oretta, so please you, I will carry you great part of the way a horseback with one of the finest stories in the world. Indeed, sir, replied the lady, I pray you do so, and I shall deem it the greatest of favours. Whereupon the gentleman, who perhaps was no better master of his weapon than of his story, began a tale, which in itself was indeed excellent, but which, by repeating the same word 3, 4, or 6 times, and now and again harking back saying, I say not well, and erring not seldom in the names, setting one in place of another, he utterly spoiled, besides which his mode of delivery accorded very ill with the character of the persons and incidents, insomuch that Madonna Oretta, as she listened, did oft sweat, and was like to faint, as if she were ill, and at the point of death; and being at length able to bear no more of it, witting that the gentleman had got into a mess, and was not like to get out of it, she said pleasantly to him, Sir, this horse of yours trots too hard, I pray you be pleased to set me down. The gentleman, being perchance more quick of apprehension than he was skilful in narration, missed not the meaning of her sally, and took it in all good and gay humour. So, leaving unfinished the tale which he had begun, and so mishanded, he addressed himself to tell her other stories. End of Day 6, the first story.
Day 6, the second story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Miette. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 6, the second story. Sisti, a baker, by an apt speech gives Messer Jerry Spina to know that he has by inadvertence asked that of him which he should not.
All the ladies and the men alike, having greatly commended Madonna Oretta's apt saying, the queen bade Pampinea follow suit, and thus she began.
Fair ladies, I cannot myself determine whether nature or fortune be the more at fault, the one in furnishing a noble soul with a vile body, or the other in allotting a base occupation to a body endowed with a noble soul, whereof we may have seen an example among others in our fellow citizen Sisti, whom, furnished though he was with a most lofty soul, fortune made a baker. And verily I should curse nature and fortune alike, did I not know that nature is most discreet, and that fortune, albeit the foolish imagine her blind, has 1,000 eyes. For it is, I suppose, that, being wise above a little, they do as mortals ofttimes do, who, being uncertain as to their future, provide against contingencies by burying their most precious treasures in the basest places in their houses, as being the least likely to be suspected, whence in the hour of their greatest need they bring them forth, the base place having kept them more safe than the dainty chamber would have done. And so these two arbitresses of the world would seldom hide their most precious commodities in the obscurity of their crafts, that are reputed most base, that thence being brought to light they may shine with a brighter splendour. Whereof how in a trifling matter Sisti, the baker, gave proof, restoring the eyes of the mind to Messer Jerry Spina, whom the story of his wife, Madonna Oretta, has brought to my recollection. I am minded to show you in a narrative which shall be of the briefest. I say then that Pope Boniface, with whom Messer Jerry Spina stood very high in favour and honour, having sent drivers of his courtiers to Florence as ambassadors to treat of certain matters of great moment, and they being lodged in Messer Jerry's house, where he treats with them of the said affairs of the Pope, 'twas for some reason or other the wont of Messer Jerry, and the ambassadors of the Pope to pass almost every morning by Santa Maria Ugi, where Sisti the baker had his bakehouse, and plied his craft in person. Now, albeit fortune had allotted him a very humble occupation, she had nevertheless prospered him therein to such a degree that he was grown most wealthy, and without ever aspiring to change it for another, lived in most magnificent style, having among his other good things a cellar of the best wines, white and red, that were to be found in Florence or the country parts. And marking Messer Jerry and the ambassadors of the Pope pass every morning by his door, he bethought him that, as 'twas very hot, 'twould be a very courteous thing to give them to drink of his good wine. But comparing his rank with that of Messer Jerry, he deemed it unseemly to presume to invite him, and cast about how he might lead Messer Jerry to invite himself. So, wearing always the whitest of doublets, and a spotless apron, he denoted rather the miller than the baker. He let bring every morning about the hour that he expected Messer Jerry and the ambassadors to pass by his door, a spick and span bucket of fresh and cool spring water, and a small Bolognese flagon of his good white wine, and 2 beakers that shone like silver, so bright were they. And there down he sat him, as they came by, and after hawking once or twice, fell a-drinking his wine with such gusto that 'twould have raised a thirst in a corpse. Which Messer Jerry, having observed on 2 successive mornings, said on the 3rd, "What is it, Sisti? Isn't it good?" Whereupon Sisti jumped up and answered, "Ay, sir, good it is, but in what degree I might no means make you understand unless you tasted it." Messer Jerry, in whom either the heat of the weather or unwonted fatigue, or perchance the gusto with which he had seen Sisti drink, had bred a thirst, turned to the ambassadors and said with a smile, "Gentlemen, 'twere well to test the quality of this worthy man's wine. It may be such that we shall not repent us." And so, in a body, they came up to see where Sisti stood, who, having caused a goodly bench to the beakers, said, "Stand back, comrades, and leave this office to me, for I know as well how to serve wine as to bake bread, and expect not to taste a drop yourselves." Which said, he washed 4 fine new beakers with his own hands, and having sent for a small flagon of his good wine, he heedfully filled the beakers and presented them to Messer Jerry and his companions, who deemed the wine the best that they had drunk for a good while. So Messer Jerry, having praised the wine not a little, came there to drink every morning with the ambassadors as long as they tarried with him. Now, when the ambassadors had received their congé and were about to depart, Messer Jerry gave a grand banquet, to which he bade some of the most honourable of the citizens, and also Sisti, who could by no means be induced to come. However, Messer Jerry bade one of his servants go fetch a flask of Sisti's wine, and serve half a beaker thereof to each guest at the first course. The servant, somewhat offended perhaps that he had not been suffered to taste any of the wine, took with him a large flask, which Sisti no sooner saw than, "Son," quoth he, "Messer Jerry does not send thee to me." And often as the servant affirmed that he did, he could get no other answer, wherewith he was fain at last to return to Mr. Jerry. "Go, get thee back," said Mr. Jerry, "and tell him that I do send thee to him, and if he answers thee so again, ask him to whom I send thee." So the servant came back and said, "Sisty, Mr. Jerry does for sure send me to thee." "Son," answered Sisty, "Mr. Jerry does for sure not send thee to me." "To whom then," said the servant, "does he send me?" "To Arno," returned Sisty. Which being reported by the servant to Mr. Jerry, the eyes of his mind were straightway opened, and "Let me see," quoth he to the servant, "what flask it is thou takest there." And when he had seen it, "Sisty says sooth," he added, and having sharply chidden him, he caused him take with him a suitable flask, which when Sisty saw, "Now know I," quoth he, "that 'tis indeed Mr. Jerry that sends thee to me," and blithely filled it. And having replenished the rundlet that same day with wine of the same quality, he had it carried with due care to Mr. Jerry's house, and followed after himself, where finding Mr. Jerry, he said, "I would not have you think, sir, that I was appalled by the great flask your servant brought me this morning. 'Twas but that I thought you had forgotten that which by my little beakers I gave you to understand, when you were with me of late, to wit, that this is no table wine, and so wished this morning to refresh your memory. Now, however, being minded to keep the wine no longer, I have sent you all I have of it to be henceforth entirely at your disposal." Mr. Jerry set great store by Sisty's gift, and thanked him accordingly, and ever made much of him, and entreated him as his friend. End of Day 6, the second story. Recording by Miette of Miette's Bedtime Story Podcast.
Day 6, the third story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa Jevons. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by J. M. Rigg. Day 6, the third story. Monna nonne di Pulci, by a ready retort, silences the scarce seemly jesting of the Bishop of Florence.
Pampinia's story ended, and praise not a little bestowed on Sisty, alike for his apt speech and for his handsome present, the queen was pleased to call forthwith for a story from Lauretta, who blithely thus began:
Debonair, my ladies, the excellency of wit, and our lack thereof, have been noted with no small truth, first by Pampinea, and after her by Philomela, to which topic 'twere bootless to return. Wherefore, to that which has been said touching the nature of wit, I purpose but to add one word, to remind you that its bite should be as a sheep's bite, and not as a dog's. For if it bite like a dog, 'tis no longer wit, but discourtesy. With which maxim the words of Madonna Oretta and the apt reply of Cisti accorded excellently. True indeed it is, that if 'tis by way of retort, and one that has received a dog's bite gives the biter a like bite in return, it does not seem to be reprehensible, as otherwise it would have been. Wherefore one must consider how and when and on whom, and likewise where, one exercises one's wit. By ill observing which matters, one of our prelates did once upon a time receive no less shrewd a bite than he gave, as I will show you in a short story. While Messer Antonio d'Orso, a prelate both worthy and wise, was Bishop of Florence, there came thither a Catalan gentleman, Messer Dego de la Rata by name, being King Ruberto's marshal. Now, Dego being very goodly of person and inordinately fond of women, it so befell that of the ladies of Florence, she that he regarded with especial favour was the very beautiful niece of a brother of the said bishop. And having learned that her husband, though of a good family, was but a caitiff and avaricious in the last degree, he struck a bargain with him, that he should lie one night with the lady for 500 florins of gold. Whereupon he had the same number of popolins of silver, which were then current, gilded, and having lain with the lady, albeit against her will, gave them to her husband. Which coming to be generally known, the caitiff husband was left with the loss and the laugh against him, and the bishop, like a wise man, feigned to know naught of the affair. And so the bishop and the marshal being much together, it befell that on St. John's Day, as they rode side by side down the street whence they start to run the Palio, and took note of the ladies, the bishop espied a young gentlewoman, whom this present pestilence has reft from us, Monna Nonna de Pulci by name, a cousin of Messer Alesso Rinucci, whom you must all know, whom, for that she was lusty and fair, and of excellent discourse and good courage, and but just settled with her husband in Porta San Piero, the bishop presented to the marshal, and then, being close beside her, he laid his hand on the marshal's shoulder, and said to her, "Nonna, what thinkest thou of this gentleman, that thou mightst make a conquest of him?" Which words the lady resented as a gibe at her honour, and liked to tarnish it in the eyes of those who were not a few, in whose hearing they were spoken. Wherefore, without bestowing a thought upon the vindication of her honour, but being minded to return blow for blow, she retorted hastily, "Perchance, sir, he might not make a conquest of me, but if he did so, I should want good money." The answer stung both the marshal and the bishop to the quick, the one as contriver of the scurvy trick played upon the bishop's brother in regard of his niece, the other as thereby outraged in the person of his brother's niece, insomuch that they dared not look one another in the face, but took themselves off in shame and silence, and said never a word more to her that day. In such a case, then, the lady having received a bite, 'twas allowable in her wittily to return it. End of Day 6, the third story.
Day 6, the fourth story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by J. M. Rigg. Day 6, the fourth story. Cicibio, cook to Corrado Gianfigliazzi, owes his safety to a ready answer, whereby he converts Corrado's wrath into laughter, and evades the evil fate with which Corrado had threatened him.
Lauretta being now silent, all lauded Nonna to the skies, after which Neifila received the queen's command to follow suit, and thus began.
Albeit, loving ladies, ready wit not seldom ministers words apt and excellent and congruous with the circumstances of the speakers, 'tis also true that fortune at times comes to the aid of the timid, and unexpectedly sets words upon the tongue which in a quiet hour the speaker could never have found for himself. The which 'tis my purpose to show you by my story. Corrado Gianfigliazzi, as the eyes and ears of each of you may bear witness, has ever been a noble citizen of our city, open-handed and magnificent, and one that lived as a gentleman should with hounds and hawks, in which, to say nothing at present of more important matters, he found unfailing delight. Now, having one day hard by Peretola dispatched a crane with one of his falcons, finding it young and plump, he sent it to his excellent cook, a Venetian, Cicibio by name, bidding him roast it for supper and make a dainty dish of it. Cicibio, who looked, as he was, a very green head, had dressed the crane and set it to the fire and was cooking it carefully, when, the bird being all but roasted and the fumes of the cooking very strong, it so chanced that a girl, Brunetta by name, that lived in the same street, and of whom Cicibio was greatly enamoured, came into the kitchen, and perceiving the smell and seeing the bird, began coaxing Cicibio to give her a thigh. By way of answer, Cicibio fell a singing, "You get it not from me, Madame Brunetta, you get it not from me." Whereat Madame Brunetta was offended, and said to him, "By God, if thou givest it me not, thou shalt never have aught from me to pleasure thee." In short, there was not a little altercation, and in the end Cicibio, fain not to vex his mistress, cut off one of the crane's thighs and gave it to her. So the bird was set before Corrado and some strangers that he had at table with him, and Corrado, observing that it had but one thigh, was surprised, and sent for Cicibio, and demanded of him what was become of the missing thigh. Whereto the mendacious Venetian answered readily, "The crane, sir, has but one thigh and one leg." "What the devil!" rejoined Corrado in a rage. "So the crane has but one thigh and one leg? Think'st thou I never saw crane before this?" But Cicibio continued, "'Tis even so as I say, sir, and so please you, I will show you that so it is in the living bird." Corrado had too much respect for his guests to pursue the topic. He only said, "Since thou promisest to show me in the living bird what I have never seen or heard tell of, I bid thee do so to-morrow, and I shall be satisfied. But if thou fail, I swear to thee by the body of Christ that I will serve thee so that thou shalt ruefully remember my name for the rest of thy days." No more was said of the matter that evening, but on the morrow at daybreak, Corrado, who had by no means slept off his wrath, got up still swelling therewith, and ordered his horses, mounted Cicibio on a hackney, and saying to him, "We shall soon see which of us lied yesternight, thou or I," set off with him for a place where there was much water, beside which there were always cranes to be seen about dawn. Cicibio, observing that Corrado's ire was unabated, and knowing not how to bolster up his lie, rode by Corrado's side in a state of the utmost trepidation, and would gladly, had he been able, have taken to flight. But, as he might not, he glanced now ahead, now aback, now aside, and saw everywhere naught but cranes standing on 2 feet. However, as they approached the river, the very first thing they saw upon the bank was a round dozen of cranes, standing each and all on 1 foot, as is their wont when asleep. When Cicibio presently pointed out to Corrado, saying, "Now may you see well enough, sir, that 'tis true as I said yesternight, that the crane has but 1 thigh and 1 leg. Mark but how they stand over there." Whereupon Corrado, "Wait," quoth he, "and I will show thee that they have each thighs and legs twain." So having drawn a little nigher to them, he ejaculated, "Oh!" which caused the cranes to bring each the other foot to the ground, and after hopping a step or two, to take to flight. Corrado then turned to Cicibio, saying, "How now, rogue? Art satisfied that the bird has thighs and legs twain?" Whereto Cicibio, all but beside himself with fear, made answer, "Ay, sir, but you cried not 'Oh ho!' to our crane of yestereve. Had you done so, it would have popped its other thigh and foot forth, as these have done." Which answer Corrado so much relished that all his wrath changed to jollity and laughter. "Cicibio," quoth he, "thou art right. Indeed, I ought to have so done." Thus did Cicibio by his ready and jocund retort arrest impending evil, and make his peace with his master. End of Day 6, the fourth story. Recording by Ruth Golding.